In May 1992, 47 years after the end of the Second World War, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, unveiled a statue at the RAF Church of St Clement Danes in the Strand. Amidst protests from German dignitaries, the statue of Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris was erected not only as a permanent acknowledgement of the immense contribution he made to the Allied war effort, but also of the men he commanded, and in particular of the 55,000 who lost their lives. Those men were the backbone of the RAF's largest fighting force, Bomber Command. In 1940, after the Battle of Britain, those brave pilots of Fighter Command were immortalized as the few. In the years to come, fighting against staggering odds, the men and women of Bomber Command were to make their supreme sacrifice as the many. Winston Churchill noted in September 1940, "The fighters are our salvation, but the bombers alone provide the means of victory." When Britain entered the war, Bomber Command was in a state of transition, hastily expanding to meet its commitments. Its complement of aircraft were almost obsolete, the Squadron still awaiting replacement long-range heavy bombers, which were still in development. The air crews, although superbly trained to peacetime standards, had little, if any, experience of nighttime bombing, with its added problems of accurate navigation and target finding. The present policy was for daylight raids, with no fighter escort, as the general belief was that the bomber would always get through.
The Royal Air Force started expanding in 1936 and recruited volunteers from the Dominions, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa, and the early days in bombing, the idea was that with mass formations, they could carry out raids on the shipbuilding, naval dockyards of Wilhelmshaven, Kiel and Emden and so forth. But they were disastrous because the idea was that mass formations would be self-protective, but the bombers in those days, the Whitleys, Hamdens and Wellingtons, had inadequate defences in their turrets, and they were pounced by fighters, German 109s, and we had some heavy losses of pre-war professional crews. This was, the failure of those tactics caused the Bomber Command to take to night bombing.
In September 1939, Bomber Command had only 53 squadrons, of which only 33 were considered operational, and 10 of those had been dispatched to France. The squadrons were equipped with 4 main aircraft. All were sound in design, but at least 6 years old in concept, and all twin-engined. These aircraft were the Whitley, which could carry up to an 8,000-pound bomb load, and was known amongst its crews as the Flying Barn Door. The Hamden, which, in spite of its poor armament and cramped crew conditions, was well liked by the air crews, who named it the Flying Suitcase. The Wellington, which was to carry the lion's share of operational duties and became loved by its crews, not only for its capabilities as a bomber, but in the fact that it could sustain a terrific amount of battle damage and still get its crews back to base. And the Blenheim, which, although woefully vulnerable to fighter attack and found to be deficient in both defensive armament and armour, went on to bear the brunt of much of the fighting on every front for the first 3 years of the war. In fact, the Blenheim was the very first British warplane to cross the enemy's frontier after Britain's declaration of war, marking Bomber Command's baptism into the conflict.
In the early days, the first 2 years of the serious war, We had only, of course, the aircraft I've just mentioned with 2 engines, unable to fly much above 15,000 feet, carrying relatively light bomb loads, and they had no navigational aids like radar and so on, and the only means of navigating was by either seeing the ground or taking sextant shots of the stars. The problem was, of course, in those days of flying those heights, aircraft were often forced to fly in the weather rather than over it, and the weather many times was as hazardous as the enemy. And of course, in places like the Rhineland and so on, industrial haze prevented effective sighting of the ground. Moonlight nights or fairly dark nights, you could see rivers and that sort of thing, but it was very difficult to navigate by what, other than by what was known as DR, dead reckoning. And the net result of all this, bombing attacks on German industrial areas and cities like the Ruhr and the naval dockyards and things was very ineffective. And in the early days, we were lucky if we got 80 or 90 aircraft airborne to the targets. And the effect was, the nuisance value, of course, was tremendous in the sense of keeping the German fighter and flak defences alerted. But the bombing results were negligible.
One raid in 1940 marked a great turning point for Bomber Command's offensive. During the lead-up to the Battle of Britain and preparation for Operation Sea Lion, Hitler had repeatedly told the German nation that no enemy bombs would fall on German soil. However, since May of that year, Bomber Command had already been attacking German targets as the start of their strategic bombing offensive, but with little effect on the morale of the enemy. On the 25th of August, 1940, following raids by the Luftwaffe on London and other English cities, the War Cabinet sanctioned the first raid deep into the heart of Germany. The target was Berlin. Hitler was so enraged by this raid that he immediately ordered the Blitz to be increased on the British cities. This gave fighter command, with all the might of the Luftwaffe now turned away from their airfields and radar installations, the time to regroup and rearm. During the period from the 7th of September until the 12th of November 1940, the Luftwaffe flew 58 major raids against London. There was only one night when the German bombers were not over the capital. Some 15,000 Londoners were killed and many thousands more injured, and the damage to the city was devastating. On the 15th of November, Coventry was the target, the German bombers destroying nearly 1/3 of the houses and causing some 1,100 casualties. This raid was followed by attacks on Birmingham, Southampton, Bristol, Sheffield, and Liverpool. In December, London was attacked again, with many more casualties, and a great number of the capital's historic buildings left in ruins. These were dark days for the British people, but the spirit of the nation was untarnished. They worked relentlessly to keep the British war effort going. Throughout the months ahead, the Luftwaffe continued the endless raids, attempting to knock out the British ports and cripple the inland industrial areas. The Blitz came to an end on the night of the 10th of May, with the heaviest attack of all on London. This final raid left over 1/3 of Greater London streets in ruins, and 1,436 citizens died.
The Blitz was not to be repeated because one of the things that Bomber Command's operations all over Germany from the early days, as I said earlier, was effectively did was to cause the Luftwaffe to go on the defensive. And in fact, towards the end of the war, fighter production in Germany went up, but bomber production went down to less than 10%. They did build a lot of fighter bombers, which of course used on the Eastern Front, the Russian front, and they were used, as you know full well, for many sporadic raids like Coventry and so on in this country, but never again did this country ever see a blitzkrieg again, a blitz.
By the beginning of 1941, the long-awaited heavy bombers had started to roll off the production lines. During this period, there were 3 new additions to the bomber force. The Sterling was the first of the RAF's 4-engined heavies to see combat, able to carry bomb loads far greater than any of its predecessors. The second was the Halifax, also a strong, heavy 4-engined bomber, which, although it was troublesome in its early months, went on to become one of the great aircraft of the war. The third off the line was the Manchester, a 2-engined aircraft which, soon after its birth, gave the RAF cause for concern. Engine problems made them extremely unreliable on operations, although the aircraft was basically a fine design. During 1941, Bomber Command were flying sorties day and night, trying to disrupt the German transport system in an attempt to destroy the morale of the population, and in particular, the will of the industrial workers. But in the effort, as the bomb tonnage increased, so did the casualties. This was indeed a somber time for Bomber Command. It was quite obvious that they were not gaining the results to justify their heavy casualties, either by day or night raids. Following disastrous losses by Bomber Command during the previous year, the Air Ministry in February 1942 introduced a new directive. The policy was drawn up for a force of no less than 4,000 bombers, which would be used to bomb Germany on such a scale that it would destroy the very foundations of the German war machine. On the 23rd of February, Air Marshal Sir Richard Pearse was replaced as Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command by Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see.
Bomber Harris, a determined and forceful character, was convinced that the bombing of Germany would bring her to her knees and ultimately be decisive in winning the war. At the time of his entry into the command, the RAF had also introduced 2 new advantages. Firstly, a new navigation device, G, which would make the locating of targets easier, and secondly, a new heavy bomber, the Lancaster. A few days prior to Harris taking his command, a new directive was issued by the Air Ministry. In effect, this was a policy for area bombing to be introduced, whereby large targets such as whole towns and cities were to become the targets, instead of the previous individual factories and military areas. And these raids were to be carried out solely at night, with the selection of targets being restricted to the range of G, which was 400 miles. For the task ahead, Harris had inherited a force of aircraft no stronger in numbers than the year before, the heavy losses having stemmed any expansion of the force. However, the reliable Lancaster had appeared and would increase in numbers rapidly, soon replacing the aged Hampden and the ill-fated Manchester. The Whitley was also soon to end its career. So although the actual number of aircraft was the same, the bomb carrying capacity was considerably higher, and with the aid of G, they could navigate far more easily. Bomber Harris also boosted the morale of his command with his lively, positive and effective mind. He immediately introduced improvements in operational procedures. The first of these was the principle of concentrating bombing on one target. No longer were Bomber Command going to attack 2 or 3 targets at a time and spread the raids over many hours. From now on, they were going to attack one prime target, hard and fast, concentrating the raid over 2 hours or less.
And the advent of the four-engine bomber meant, A, that they could fly over the weather more often than not, at over 20,000 feet, carried a much bigger bomber-load, and of course had a much greater range. And equipped with radar, it wasn't until 42, the time when Sir Arthur Harris, or Air Marshal Harris as he was then, took over command of Bomber Command at High Wycombe in 1942. He'd been a group commander before that, and at that time, from 42 on, the Bomber Command became a very effective weapon.
Although it now seemed that Harris had the basic tools for the job, he didn't rush into sending out raids haphazard. The first few months were mainly used to concentrate on training and steady development of the new weapons and principles. He was not prepared to send out his bombers on wasted efforts. Experience had shown Bomber Command the folly of such operations. As the months drew on in 1942, losses were still high, as the German defenses were rapidly improving. Nearly 1 million enemy soldiers manned the massive anti-aircraft systems, and a further 1.5 million were employed in repairing bomb damage. Bomber Harris felt that the future of Bomber Command's ability was still in doubt. So he approached the War Cabinet with a plan. His bold idea was to assemble a force of over 1,000 bombers and to send them all to one target on one raid, the anticipated effect being that it would crush the morale of the German people. The idea was well received. Harris only had 400 operational aircraft available at the time, but there were many more in conversion and training units. He used to call on all of them to mount his massive campaign. The next part of the plan was designed to minimize the high risk of enemy fighter interception. This was to reduce the time spent over the target. Normal raids allowed 2 hours for 200 or so aircraft to pass over the target area. These new raids were to have only 90 minutes. This immediately brought about the fear of collisions. The chosen target, when the final battle orders were given on the 26th of May, was Hamburg. But the weather conditions were not favorable, so the second target was chosen. On the night of the 30th of May, a massive formation of 1,047 aircraft were dispatched to raid the city of Cologne.
The biggest problem was, of course, we weren't allowed to use navigation lights. You had no lights on the ground. You had to be aware of other aircraft simply by the fact you were meeting up with a slipstream of some previous chap in front of you, or you'd see the exhaust stubs on the Rolls-Royce engines of a plane very close to you. Biggest problem was, of course, collision. And particularly if you had German night fighters get into the stream, and any aircraft had to take evasive action, and of course that caused problems because you were really in some cases flying across the main stream.
Every member of the crew looked out. Every member of the crew had a section to search. And on top of that, of course, as has been said recently in the Gulf War, the friendly fire was always our enemy as well. Namely, people drop bombs on you, very close misses with aircraft. When you're running 800 to 1,000 aircraft through into a target in 15 minutes, there's an awful lot of aeroplanes and the sky is big, but when you're all homing onto a target, then it's very, very difficult, and you had to watch it all the time.
Well, it was, I think, when you're absolutely scared, when you're over the target and you hear supposing, for example, there was no flak on any particular night, you knew there were fighters. There was fighters operating with the help of searchlights. And then suddenly you would hear the rear gunner saying, "We've got a fighter on our tail, coming up behind us." And you had to keep an absolute straight and level course. And I was trying to work out the course to come home, and you try to do mental arithmetic when you know you've got a fighter on your tail.
It has been stated that a bomber crew had no more than a 1 in 10 chance of survival, and during some periods of the war, considerably less. It's impossible to imagine what it was like for an operational crew, knowing they were going off deep into enemy territory, with little or no protection against the heavy defences surrounding their targets.
I've just been told that our number is expected to be over 1,100. This group is providing 150. This station, 22 are here, and 5 crews are playing away. Now, the object of tonight's operation is to blot out the town of Bremen.
One of the hazards that used to face us was you went in a stream, the bombers travelled in a stream, and you would look in the Astrodome, as you get near the target, you'd look up, because you're all staggered at different heights, and you'd look up at the aircraft above you, and you'd see his bomb doors open, and you'd see the bombs all there. And then you'd see them start to fall, and they'd come down, you know, sort of each side of you.
What frightens you is noise. If at this moment we heard some firing just around the corner, we'd probably dive down on the ground and it would frighten us. But when you're flying an aeroplane with your headsets on and the noise of the engines, you don't hear the flak from the ground being fired at you. You might feel a crump as you hit a bit of air is disturbed, and you'll see black and white puffs near you. But I didn't find that frightening because you're so detached from it. It's only if you saw a fighter, which you didn't often see at night, but at period, then you really knew he was after you and very close to you.
When you first got in the aircraft, you were busy, and you went out on the raid, you crossed the water, and the flak started to come up. You were scared, but you weren't petrified because you were busy, you were still busy. I think really what upset me most was seeing an aircraft that was on fire and going down. It was going down like a falling leaf. I couldn't see anybody get out of it. I felt terribly sick then. But I think when we got back to base and after the debriefing, I got into bed and I remember I felt so cold and lonely. That was when it really hit me. And of course, when you saw your name on the board again for an op that night, you didn't like it.
I don't believe anybody who says they weren't frightened at some time or other. My principal worry was getting badly hit so that the aircraft burnt. I wasn't too worried about having to get out if we could get out, but my real worry was either getting down in flames or the wing coming off and you're really in dead trouble.
You had to keep your eyes open because suddenly they come out of the darkness and you wouldn't know anything until suddenly you've got tracers coming at you. And so the idea was not to go into combat, was to yell out to the skipper, corkscrew right or corkscrew left, which meant that they went down in a spiral to get out of the line of the fighter and hopefully he'd go over the top. On the other hand, of course, they used to come up from underneath, and that's where lots of the aircraft were shot down, because the Jerry fighters had a gun that went straight up, and it would hit they used to come up underneath the main wings, hit the target, which was the petrol tanks. The whole thing just exploded.
Well, you know, you wouldn't be human if you didn't feel a bit sort of tensed up. I mean, you know, it could get a bit hairy, and the chop rate was quite heavy. They reckon a Lancaster, when it was built, would cover 6 raids, and that would be the life of it. So sometime, you know, you knew, it was like, there's always doing that one too many. You can't stay lucky all the time.
Morale was highly important because the losses in Bomber Command were enormous. But no matter how big the losses, our morale was always high. There was always volunteers coming forward to replace the losses. The dedication, because everybody realized Bomber Command was the one force that was able to strike back at the enemy.
Bomber Command now had a powerful force and a dynamic commander, yet all was far from well. G had not produced the expected improvements in target finding and bombing accuracy. It was found that over 60% of bombs dropped had not been hitting their targets, and all the time the effectiveness of the German defenses was rapidly increasing. For some time, Bomber Command had been using raid leaders. These were crews who'd shown exceptional courage and above-average skill to find and bomb their targets. Despite the fierce opposition of Bomber Harris, not wanting to create an elite element within his force, he was given a directive by his superiors. He was to form a new force from those exceptional crews, a force that would be solely responsible for finding and marking the targets for the mainstream of bombers flying overhead. On the 11th of August 1942, under the command of a distinguished pilot, Wing Commander Don Bennett, the Pathfinder Force was introduced into the RAF.
Well, he is an extraordinary man. At 32 years of age, he forms the Pathfinder Force, and a great operator, had been a great man in civil life. And to show the dynamism of the man, I was called into his office one afternoon at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I was based at RAF Whitton, and I'd not heard any rumor of any new squadron forming. And he said to me, "You will form 163 Squadron at Whitton tomorrow, and you'll operate tomorrow night." And when he said that, there wasn't an aircraft, an air crew, or a ground crew for that squadron on the station. And they came in early the next morning. The ground crew came in overnight from a unit that had never had mosquitoes. 6 airplanes and crews came in that morning. And we didn't go out that night because of weather. We went out a night later. We operated within 48 hours of being told to form a squadron.
One of the most successful aircraft used by the Pathfinder squadrons was the Mosquito. It had been said that the bomber would always get through. The Mosquito could and did just that.
Now we had an airplane fast, which could fly on one engine. All other twin-engine airplanes, you had to struggle to keep them in the air on one engine. You could actually climb on one engine in a Mosquito. That was in the early days. As they got heavier and heavier and bigger bomb loads, then the single-engine performance wasn't quite so great. But it was still a wonderful airplane, and it was by far the bomber that flew the highest of any bombers in Bomber Command.
I was one of the original Pathfinders. And then we had the scientific devices that could find targets and mark targets. And that was the beginning of the end of Hitler's Reich.
You were given the height of the aircraft, the range of the target, the actual target, the time to drop, the wind speeds, the amount of flares that would be dropped. The whole thing was fed into this computer box, and you came out hopefully with the right answers, which would tell you back to the radar stations to tell the Mosquitoes when to drop the target indicators.
With the entry of the Pathfinders and the 1,000 bomber raids, there had been a boost in morale amongst the air crews. But towards the end of 1942, that spirit of enthusiasm had started to decline. Although they were hitting their targets and causing considerable damage, they were still not really affecting the German war machine. The bomb damage was soon repaired, and enemy fighter production was rapidly increasing, causing Bomber Command's losses to be once again at a high level. The air crews were expected to complete a first tour of 30 operations, and then, after a rest period, complete a further tour of 20 operations. The casualty rate was 4% during this period. This meant that out of every 100 air crew flying 50 operations, only 13 would survive.
The Germans had in 1941 a searchlight barrier from Emden down to France, and you were forced to fly through it. And that meant that if you got caught by a master searchlight, you would immediately, 30 were focused on you, and you could read a newspaper in the cockpit. I saw on one night 5 aircraft go down in flames on either side of me. I was lucky, and we went on, I think, somewhere like Berlin or something.
Whilst I believe, and Don Bennett claims that I selected 20,000 Pathfinders, I lost 1/3 of them, so I never celebrated a victory, having lost 1/3 of my selected and first-class Pathfinders.
Now, July the 2nd, 5 of us, a group captain, the wing commander, and 3 of us, what they call ordinaries, flight lieutenants. I was a warrant officer then, of course, flight lieutenant. We went low-level attack on the shipyards on Mosquitoes, so the first one low-level. Submarine yards at Flens, but the group captain got shot down by flak, and the wing commander who was just beside me, behind us, he got shot down by a fighter.
My biggest upsets in those days was that the crews I was with, the stations I was with, there was quite a lot of losses. And the worst thing was perhaps you go to sleep yourself and there'd be a couple of crews missing in the morning, and the effects officer would be around and take away all their stuff. So, but they didn't give you a chance to look at empty beds, because by lunchtime, 2 new crews had come in. And you miss companions and friends, but you didn't share, shall I say, the same grief as you would if it was, shall we say, a relative. When a relative dies, it takes a while, but the air crews, they were just coming and going, and you were keeping your fingers crossed it wasn't going to be you that night.
Devastating, really. We got to know them quite well, and when they did fail to return, something went into you somehow or other, but the next day you had to carry on as nothing had happened.
I think, you know, if you've been to Munich or Stuttgart or someplace like that, and you came up across Selseybill on the way home, and the sun would be coming up in the east, and you'd dawn, and you'd see, you hadn't seen an aircraft all night except over the target. And then you'd gradually see 1 aircraft, then 2, and then 3, and then a dozen. And you could see all the ones that have been shot up, some on 3 engines, some on 2 engines with 1 wing way up in the air on those 2 good engines. And it was perhaps one of the most beautiful sights you could ever wish to see, everybody coming home.
It's difficult to grasp the sheer scale of Bomber Command's prolonged offensive during the war. By March 1943, Bomber Harris had 62 squadrons at his disposal with over 1,200 aircraft. New navigational aids and target locating devices had been introduced with the advent of oboe and H2S. Harris had regarded 1942 as Bomber Command's preliminary phase, developing bombing techniques and awaiting those new devices. Now that his squadrons were trained and equipped, they were about to enter his main offensive, a sustained and major effort against Germany. The first stage in these offensives opened on the night of the 5th of March, when 442 aircraft bombed the city of Essen. This was the start of the Battle of the War. One raid during this period stands out as perhaps being the most celebrated, for it certainly provided a much-needed boost to Bomber Command morale. On the night of the 16th of May, 19 Lancasters of 617 Squadron, led by Wing Commander Guy Gibson, attacked the Mona, Sorpe, and Eder dams. The squadron had trained specifically for this raid for many months, and on the night of the attack, they flew in low across the reservoirs and attacked. The bomb they used was especially designed for the raid by Barnes Wallace, dropping from the aircraft and skimming across the water. 8 aircraft were lost, but the Myrna and Ada dams were breached and the Zorba was badly damaged. For this raid, Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross. 34 other crew members were also decorated for their bravery.
We came into the Mona Dam at the far end and circled around, waiting for Gibson to call the planes in. He called us in by number. He went in first, and then 4 more followed him. That made 5. And when the 5th one went in, he saw that the dam had burst. We were number 6, and he'd just called us in. We were just going down to make the attack, and he said, "Hold it, Dave, because the dam's gone. I want you and Les Knight and Henry Maudsley to go on to the Ada Dam," which we did. We got to the Ada Dam, which was a very good, difficult dam to attack. There was a lot of flak at Mona, but there weren't any flak at the Ada because I think the Germans thought that nobody could get in to attack the dam because it was behind a big spit of land. Anyway, we found it, and Henry Maudsley attacked first, and unfortunately he blew himself up on the dam. He dropped his mine too late. It hit the top and blew the plane up, although he got back 60 miles back to England before he was shot down. We had to get down to 60 feet, the height and the speed and everything else, which was very difficult in about 3/4 of a mile because we were going at 230 miles an hour. And 3 times we had to abort. I had to tell Dave the target's gone, we have to go round again. Anyway, we went in first before Les Knight, after we'd been round 2 or 3 times, dropped our mine, saw it explode, and the water came up to about 1,000 feet, the spurt of water was. And we knocked about 9 feet from the top of the dam. We saw that, but not down to the water line. And then Les Knight, he came round after 2 or 3 attempts, dropped his mine, and his went down lower, and the Ada Dam was breached. And we circled around and watched the water pouring through, saw cars on the road down below being submerged, the lights gradually subdued, and still you couldn't see them anymore. And Gibson said that's good, because he was flying around all the time watching us. And he said, now get back to base, which we did. The whole trip took, from leaving Scampton to getting back to Scampton, took 6 hours and 20 minutes. And we were pretty well elated when we got back because we knew that both the dams that we'd had to attack had been breached. The other crews attacked the Sorpy and the Enneper Dam, but they didn't have much success. And on the raid, we sent out 19 planes, and 2 had to turn back because they were damaged on the way. And so we lost 8 out of 17, really, which was quite a lot.
It must be mentioned that every air crew member in Bomber Command was a volunteer, a heroic feat in itself, considering the odds stacked against their chances of survival.
I joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force in 1941 and trained in New Zealand as a pilot, and came straight to England after 6 months training and spent the rest of the war here. Many of us who came away together didn't go back. We lost 2,000 New Zealanders in Bomber Command alone during the war, which proportionately was a very large number.
In Bomber Command, they started forming later on Canadian squadrons, Australian squadrons, and so on. But people forget there were 14 Polish squadrons in the Royal Air Force, 4 of which were in Bomber Command.
Well, I became an instructor for a while, and then I went into the Light Night Striking Force, which say was a fantastic jump forward operation. And we had 2 main tasks. One was to go out with the main force and the other pathfinders in the Pathfinder force, and to set up dummy attacks to confuse the enemy defenses. We'd go along in the mainstream, and then at some predetermined point we'd branch off. and would toss out of our airplane lumps of tin foil, which would create on the radar tubes the appearance of lots of airplanes. And the main force would go one way, and we'd go the other, with the aim of attracting the German night fighters to us.
The Mosquito was also used by Bomber Command on small strategic targets of high importance.
We attacked all sorts of targets on the ground, tanks, lorries, trains, bridges, and some of the more important targets like the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen. We had to attack those at 0 feet by placing the delayed action bombs in the front door. This was done so as that the political prisoners that were being kept on the top floor by the Gestapo to try to stop us from bombing the targets from above, we put the bombs in the front door so that no harm would come to these political prisoners.
Let the Nazis take good note of the western horizon. There they will see a cloud as yet no bigger than a man's hand. But behind that cloud lies the whole massive power of the United States of America. When the storm bursts over Germany, they will look back to the days of Lubeck and Rostock and Cologne, as a man caught in the blasts of a hurricane will look back to the gentle zephyrs of last summer. It may take a year, it may take 2, but for the Nazis, the writing is on the wall.
Operation Point Blank had begun in early 1943, culminating in late February 1944, when for 6 days and nights, Bomber Command and the American 8th Air Force combined in the Big Week, dropping over 16,000 tons of bombs over Germany. During this stage of the war, some 26,000 acres in 43 German cities had been devastated. Bomber Command had flown 75,000 individual sorties, from which 2,864 aircraft were lost and more than 20,000 aircrew were killed or missing. The RAF's morale was at a low ebb. The effect on the German war machine was minimal, but it had put Germany on the defensive. The resources necessary for their massive anti-aircraft defense system drained away much-needed reinforcements and supplies for both the eastern and the western fronts. After the raid on the Ruhr dams, 617 Squadron had been reserved for specific precision bombing raids, and much against Harris's normal policy, he allowed them to become an elite squadron. One man in this prestigious squadron was destined to become a legend. Group Captain Leonard Cheshire took command of 617 Squadron in October 1943. During his war career, he flew 100 operations, showing incredible feats of valor. Against all odds, 100 times he'd gone out, bombed, endured the ack-ack, fought fear, tiredness and cold, exerted all his skill, exploited all his ingenuity, and come back. He'd set an example of icy courage in every attack, thinking of nothing else but the target and the safety of his squadron.
I knew Dr. Chester for many years. When you think of it, he was a quite remarkable man in the sense that his war record was second to none. Fear didn't enter into his outlook at all, and he was, you probably know that the Pathfinder Force, which is present in commemorating their 50th anniversary, but Leonard Cheshire was in 5 Group, which virtually had a rival Pathfinder Force, which was, the mainstay was Leonard Cheshire. And he did extraordinary deep penetration raids into Germany solo in British or American fighters to mark targets deep inland in Germany. And it's quite incredible his courage and bravery. He commanded 617, the dam-busting squadron, but after the dam-busting, but if anybody deserved a VC, it was Leonard Cheshire.
The RAF Bomber Command produced the calibre of person that no other force produced. People like Group Captain Leonard Cheshire, VC, Group Captain Willie Tate, Air Commodore John Searby, Group Captain Pickard, Wing Commander Pat Daniels, Dave Shannon. There are numerous others who were dedicated, who set an example of courage and devotion to duty that kept the morale of Bomber Command to such a high degree.
You see, if you were flying in Bomber Command, as I was, from May 40 to June 41, you knew you were going to get killed. You didn't think of being a prisoner. And as time went on, the people you knew vanished. You didn't know whether they were dead or what. And it was going to happen to you. And it did, except I was a prisoner. I actually got out of camp 3 times. I was caught in 3 tunnels. I was caught cutting the wire. I was caught in various parts of the castle. We had a tunnel almost out through the German quarters, and it was through the sewers. And at first we used to put people on the toilets because you can imagine what we got from time to time. But of course people would go off for a smoke and someone would intone, you know, for what we are about to receive, may the good Lord make us truly thankful. We were caught in the sewers, and they were very worried because their head was on it. You remember that the German people, it came directly under Hitler, and if we got out, they really were in trouble. And he brought up the alarm patrol and stuck us against the wall and said either we told him where it came out, it was a maze, or he'd shoot. And they loaded rifles and pointed them, you know, and it was who was bluffing who, and he couldn't afford a mistake. Actually, he didn't shoot, but slightly worrying.
On the 6th of June, 1944, the greatest invasion force in history crossed the English Channel. Bomber Command's contribution to this awesome venture was a dense carpet of over 5,000 tons of bombs on the principal coastal batteries and concrete defense emplacements. By late June, the heavy bombers were brought in for direct tactical support of the Allied armies, laying a thick carpet of bombs in front of the ground troops as they punched their way into France. Amongst the crews, morale was now running high. There were fewer losses than ever before, bombing accuracy was greatly improving, and the scene was being set for their operational climax. When the war had started in 1939, Bomber Command was not trained or equipped either to penetrate into enemy territory by day or to find its target areas, let alone its target, by night. And by 1944, they'd been transformed into a supreme fighting force. They had become a force capable not only of inflicting massive damage by aerial bombing over the length and breadth of Germany, but also of pinpointing and destroying specific targets of strategic and tactical importance. City after city was demolished to nothing but rubble, and the morale of the German nation was shattered to an irreparable low. One German city that was all but completely destroyed, with a staggering estimated loss of life of over 50,000 inhabitants, was the city of Dresden. Much has been written about this raid, and there's been a great deal of controversy over its morality.
War is a very unpleasant business, and I don't know why people do keep raising things like Dresden, because We don't hear, on the other hand, what the Nazis did when they attacked Leningrad and places like that in Russia, where the people they killed made our casualties we inflicted sort of infinitesimal. You know, they were horrendous casualties. And again, you know, we did not start the war, but we had to do this to make sure we didn't lose it.
And in fact, the 1943, the Casablanca Conference, which was attended by Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, reaffirmed the strategy against Germany, which was to do what we were doing, to destroy their ability physically and morally, and so on. It was spelled out in some detail to carry on the war. And obviously when you're attacking industrial areas, and you see Berlin had tank factories and Bremen and all the rest of them. The Ruhr, of course, was stuffed full of armament industries. In attacking communications, marshalling yards and all the rest, you're bound to have destroyed the wherewithal of the workers, and civilians were inevitably killed.
The bombing of Dresden. This was, Harris carried out Churchill's instructions at the request of Stalin. It was a genuine military target, and I would like to say at this point, as Cheshire recently in an article stated, that the Germans slaughtered 10,000 innocent victims every day of the war.
From the very first hours of the war to the final flights over a totally ruined Germany, the men and women of Bomber Command never flinched from their duty. Their motto was strike hard, strike sure. For the air crews, this required a unique degree of courage and determination, returning night after night to the deadly skies over Europe. A fitting tribute to Bomber Harris, his crews and their ground support was perhaps one of their greatest missions of the war, and one of their last. On the 29th of April, 1945, the day before Hitler committed suicide, the bombers took off destined for Manor in Holland. This time, however, the ordnance was not bombs, but food.
The Dutch were being starved by their oppressors to such a degree that they were dying of starvation at over 1,000 a day. Command decided that something really had to be done, and it meant taking food in the simplest possible form, packed in sacks, pushed up inside the bowels, the bomb bays of Lancasters of Bomber Command. Well, to make it worse, the particular days that I went with my crews, it was a particularly filthy day. Pouring with rain, with a very low cloud base. We were creeping in under the cloud and eventually got there, and there we saw the one indicator we were to be waiting for, the smoke candles on the ground just outside and to the north of Rotterdam. There, in company with all our other companions, all around us, aircraft around us, on top of us, below us, we dropped our food, and with a heartfelt sigh, we turned to go home, and thank God it was over. And looking down, the last thing I saw, which brought the greatest sigh to me, was somehow those wonderful people had found some means, whether it was tablecloths or sheets or something, but in white letters 10 feet high on the ground, they spelt out 2 words, thank you. And after that, I couldn't bear to think of anything else, as it was the greatest operation I ever did.
Out of the RAF's losses of over 70,000 men and women killed during the conflict, 47,268 were from Bomber Command. Another 8,195 were killed on non-operational duties, and 37 were killed in ground battle. A further 8,403 were wounded. This totaled nearly 60% of the entire number of serving aircrew during the war. In all, 8,325 aircraft were lost in action. In one raid alone over Nuremberg, 95 aircraft failed to return. Their gallant young crews flew against appalling odds, knowing that their chances of survival were slim, yet they seldom faltered. Bomber Harris wrote in his dispatches of May the 8th, 1945, To all of you, I would say how proud I am to have served in Bomber Command for 4.5 years, and to have been your Commander-in-Chief through more than 3.5 years of your saga. Your task in the German war is now complete.
Many of the stories of Bomber Command can't be told because everybody died, just as my CO rarely gave his life for us. So this must have happened very often.